If you're looking to become a psychologist, then let this be your guide. With this podcast at your side, you'll be on your way to being qualified. It's the Aspiring Psychologist Podcast with Dr. Marianne Trent.
Hi, welcome along to the Aspiring Psychologist Podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of my world. One of the things I've really enjoyed about this podcast is having the ability to help you learn about new and different ways that you can gain experience or even gain formal qualifications in psychology. So that is exactly what we are doing in today's episode. And this is a method I'd never heard of before. So with that little bit of intrigue, I will leave you now, and you will then, you'll be introduced to my guest, and I will catch you on the other side. Hope you find this so useful. Hi, welcome along, and I just want to welcome and introduce our guest for today, and we are joined by Anagha Sharma. Hi, Anagha.
Hi, Marianne. It's really lovely to be here today.
It's so lovely to have you here. And I, again, accosted you on LinkedIn. So you'd connected with me, I think, after you'd read the Clinical Psychologist Collective book. And then you were like, yeah, I am going to connect with her. She seems all right. And then I spotted recently that you are something that I'd never heard of. And so I messaged you for more information. You are a trainee clinical and trainee forensic psychologist at the same time, aren't you?
Yes, that's correct.
Love it. Could you tell us a little bit more about how that works and how you got into it and what your journey was before you became a trainee? Quite a big question, that one.
That's a big question. Yeah, sure. So I'm currently a second year trainee forensic and clinical psychologist, and I'm on the University of Birmingham Forensic Clinical Psychology doctorate. So it was kind of one of the first, I think the only one in the UK at the moment, I might be wrong with that, the first combined doctorate where you can train to become a forensic and a clinical psychologist. So it's a 4-year course, and essentially it combines elements from the clinical psychology doctorate that's run at Birmingham and the forensic psychology doctorate. So in a way, typically, that if you wanted to become dual qualified as both a forensic and clinical psychologist, you would have to go and do both doctorates separately, kind of one after each other. So you do maybe clinical training first, then forensic, or vice versa. But the course was developed in a way that instead of doing 2 doctorates, which then would mean probably about 6 years at least, it kind of cuts and gets rid of anything that overlaps. So I wouldn't have to do the same teaching again when I'm doing the kind of more forensic teaching if I've had it already in the clinical elements. So in that sense, the first 2 years of the course are aligned with the clinical psychology doctorate at the university. So I have kind of clinical teaching. And then the last 2 years are with the forensic doctorate. So we join their cohort and have the forensic teaching.
Sounds amazing. And do you still have to do a thesis as part of that?
Yes. So that still includes a thesis, but you'd just be doing one. And I guess you start kind of collecting ideas for that in the first year. And then the second, third, and fourth years are kind of where that kind of goes ahead. And then you submit it in your 4th year. So I guess compared to clinical trainees, you have an extra year then to do your thesis and the write-up.
Yeah, so it's 4 years and you come out with both, and then you can register with the HCPC and the BPS as both.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, love that. Time efficiency as well, because who wants to study for 6 years if you can do it for 4? Really, really
Yeah,
good. Really
I
good.
really admire people who've done both, because I think it's very long, and I think it's a lot of hard work, but being able to do it in a shorter route and still have the same benefits, I think is really important.
And I understand from our little pre-chat that even within your cohort, perhaps some of you are funded and some of you are self-funded. So there's kind of a disparity even within the cohort.
Yeah, so the course started running in 2013, and they typically take 5 or 6 trainees kind of per cohort. So I'm self-funded, but there are some trainees who are also funded. So there isn't like as far as I'm aware, there isn't like specific places that are just self-funded or just funded. So I guess from my experiencing of self-funding, that means that you'd have to pay the university tuition fee as you would for like an undergraduate degree, and you pay a certain amount per annum. I started in 2021, and my fee per year is £13,500, which is a lot of money. You can definitely appreciate that. And I think that fee kind of changes every year, which is probably based on inflation. I'm not sure exactly what. And I guess with self-funded, that means when you do have your placement, you're on an honorary contract, so you won't necessarily get a paid placement. I know that there are some paid placements out there. I'm not sure how easy they are to find. And I guess that could be difficult, but so far my placements have been more honorary contracts. But there are some people on the course who are funded, and I know the university does have links with the Birmingham and Solihull NHS Trust and with St Andrews Healthcare, and they're a private healthcare company. I'm not entirely sure how the funding works, but I guess it would be kind of speaking with the course and speaking with kind of line management to sort that out.
Yeah. So are you eligible to apply for like student loans funding to help, or does it all have to be literally out of your own pocket?
Yeah, so eligible to apply. So I've applied for the postgraduate doctoral loan, which is held by the government, and it kind of works in a similar way as you would for like an undergraduate tuition fee. So you apply for the loan. I think the amount that you can get is around 27,000. It might be a bit more than that, because I think that regularly changes. And I guess you can do whatever you want with that kind of funding that you get, and you get it as you would in increments. So at 3 or 4 points in the year, you get that kind of money. And then you're responsible with doing with kind of whatever you want with that. But it doesn't cover the entire tuition fee. That's the only thing.
Okay. So are you having to kind of get paid employment to cover your living fees then as well?
So I think some people probably would try and do that. I think I'm quite lucky because I've been financially in a position where I could self-fund, but I appreciate that's not the case for a lot of people, and that the fees are really high. And we don't really get the traditional like health, like HEE funding that the clinical trainees would get. And it's kind of a bit more similar to the forensic in that sense, whereas because of forensic trainees tend to self-fund and don't have that allocated funding from the government or the NHS.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference, isn't there? So I remember when I was an assistant psychologist, actually at St Andrews Healthcare, and yeah, the forensic trainees were self-funding, whereas the clinical ones weren't, and it's just difficult because essentially you're doing a very similar job, and I think even some of the teaching that you're doing is pretty similar. Are you going to the clinical teaching, or is it like separate for just you six on your cohorts?
So we join the other cohort teaching, otherwise I think it'd be very small for just the 6 of us to have our teaching. So in the first 2 years, we join teaching on the clinical course. So we have all basically exclusively clinical teaching. And then in the last 2 years, the third and fourth years, we join the forensic cohort, and we have more of the forensic-based teaching then. But our placements across the kind of 4 years can be kind of exclusively clinical, so maybe in more kind of clinical NHS mental health settings, community or inpatient. But they can also be in forensic settings, so forensic mental health services, and prison or probation services as well.
I just think it sounds brilliant. Like you must, I don't know, just that depth of knowledge and experience that you're able to be acquiring is really good. So when I was an assistant, I was in forensic services. All of my assistant posts were forensic services. And I really liked that knowledge that I had to bring to the table, and my experience of working in forensic services and with, forensic psychiatrists, for example. But I was aiming down the clinical route, but it's just kind of interesting and nice to know that there is a path where you could potentially combine both of them without having to do 6 years.
Yeah, and I guess what's really helpful is about this kind of doctorate is you have clinical psychologists who can work really in a range of settings because of their training. So they can work in clinical settings, but they can also work in forensic settings. Whereas from my understanding, forensic psychologists are kind of more able to work just in forensic settings. But I guess having this doctorate means that I can work in a variety of settings and really draw on kind of the skills from both disciplines. So we know that in forensic settings, or for example in prison population, there's lots of individuals who are in there who have undiagnosed mental health needs, or their mental health needs aren't often recognized or they're not often met in that setting. But then we also know in clinical settings or in forensic mental health settings that things like risk assessment is really important on thinking about when an individual is well enough and ready enough to move on if they're in an inpatient setting into the community, and think about what that means for not only public protection, but any potential victims of kind of crime. So it's really helpful because you get training that's specific across all of those 4 years where you address both of those elements. Because I guess I was kind of keen in either applying to my course or applying to the clinical course. And kind of my plan was to keep rotating and rotating until I get into one of them. And luckily I got into my course. And I guess the only thing about the clinical course that I felt was that I would only really get, I wouldn't get much forensic teaching. And I guess the only forensic placement I'd have would be maybe on my third year on more of a specialist placement. But I get that kind of throughout with my course at the moment, which I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, so your placements are, well, my question should be, what sort of work are you doing on your placements? I know you don't, we don't want to identify exactly where you are, but, could you give us an overview or an example of what a typical placement might be for someone in your cohort?
Yeah, so I guess the placements kind of vary, but in terms of the course, we kind of align with the clinical course in that aspect that you need to gain competencies and experiences working across the lifespan. So that will include an adult placement, an older adult placement, a child and young person placement, and also kind of a neurotypical population. So for example, like a learning disabilities placement. But also to get competencies in the forensic side, you need to work with offenders and or kind of victims of crime. And we know that in a lot of settings or in a lot of cases that individuals who are victims of crime sometimes in later life then also go on to offend. So I guess with that, it kind of depends because I could be on a particular type of placement and someone else on my cohort might not be on the same type of placement, but we just have to gain competencies in all of that across the 4 years. So my kind of how the structure of the course is that in your first year, you'll have a kind of 10-month long placement. In your second year, you'll have 2 kind of placements that are 6 months. Third year, I think, or fourth year, it's kind of either 1 10-month and then 2 6 months, and that could run concurrently. So you have maybe 2 days in one service, 1 day in another service. But I guess the course is really tailored to your journey. So if you were able to get a placement that it might be better to be there for 10 months, then you might have a 10-month placement for kind of gaining specialty in that area. So it does really vary. So at the moment, I've had a 10-month forensic adult placement when I was in inpatient settings, and I'm currently on a forensic learning disability placement, and then I'll go on to have another 6-month placement at the end of kind of towards the next half of my second year, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it sounds, like just really, just very similar to the clinical. It's just that you've got that added element of forensic stuff as well. And was your journey before you applied and was successful in this place, was it already kind of quite forensic-y anyway? Could you tell us a little bit about what you did in terms of undergrad and where you went from there?
Yeah, of course. So I completed my A levels. I got into an undergrad and I did my degree in psychology. And I had some forensic modules in my third year that I really, really enjoyed. And I had some health modules that I also really, really enjoyed. So I was kind of like, oh, do I apply? I wanted to study further and do a master's. And I thought, oh, do I apply for a health psychology based master's or a forensic psychology based master's? And I ended up going with the forensic route. So I then went and did my master's in forensic psychology. And my intention at that time was to then apply for a forensic doctorate. And the master's that I was on was accredited for the stage 1 of qualification in forensic psychology. And it's kind of different from how it works, but stage 2 would mean you'd either go on and do a forensic psychology doctorate, or you would be a trainee forensic psychologist and get kind of your forensic placements, however long that might take. You wouldn't have to do a thesis, and then you'd be qualified as a forensic psychologist. So again, quite different from clinical training, and a bit different from my course. After that, I thought I would get an assistant post quite easily, but I didn't, because I didn't have a lot of experience. I think a lot of people also experienced that. So I worked as a trainee peer support worker for a few months. I then moved on to a healthcare assistant role because I wanted to get some more forensic experience. So that was in a secure forensic unit. I was there for about 8 or 9 months, and then I got my first assistant psychology post. And that was in a forensic service as well. And then after that, I was kind of at the point when I was deciding, oh, should I go down the forensic route or the clinical route, or kind of my course which is the combined elements. And I thought maybe it would be really helpful for me to step into more of a clinical post, so I could kind of see how I liked it and see kind of what the differences were from my current position at the time. So I then went on to a clinical post where I was working across 2 services. And I kind of found that I liked working in clinical settings, but forensic was really where my passion was. So after that, I decided I would apply for as I said, the forensic clinical doctorate and the clinical doctorate, because I could work in kind of either settings with both of those courses. I actually did apply for the forensic doctorate. I didn't get in. I was on first reserve. And then I also applied for my course in the same year, and I ended up getting on. So I guess compared to other people, I don't have a lot of experience before I got onto training, but more of it was forensic based.
Is it a similarly competitive course to get onto as you'd find with clinical? How did you experience that?
I would say it's kind of different in competitiveness, because I would acknowledge it is still competitive and it is kind of hard to get on the course, but it's different in the sense where clinical courses, you have a lot more places. I'm not really sure how many places there are these days, and it varies per course, but you might have kind of 20 or 30 people per cohort, and then you get kind of a really large number of people applying, and it kind of narrows down with that. But with my course, I'm assuming that less people apply, but also there's only 5 or 6 places. So it is competitive, but I think it's competitive in a different way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, brilliant. And in terms of the timeline, obviously for clinical, we tend to expect applications to open around September and to shut kind of mid-November it is now. And then interviews will be kind of springtime. How does it work in terms of your course?
Sure, yeah. So I think every year the application process opens in January, and then I can't remember the specific closing date, but it's around kind of May, June, or July. And then your interview is kind of within a month or 2. So I guess the timelines are quite different from the clinical course, where they tend to be earlier in the year. And I guess with the application, what's different is, as well, as you'd apply through the University of Birmingham. So there isn't like kind of a clearinghouse portal that you would apply. You just go directly through the university.
Great. And it starts in September, does it? Is it academic year?
Yeah, so it starts in September, and it'll be kind of September of the year you start till the September, I guess, 4 years after. I guess the timelines could vary in that sense, because if there were periods where, for example, if people are off on maternity leave or they've got extended sickness, then it's like kind of the minimum amount you would complete the courses in 4 years. But if there are reasons that you might need to extend things, then that is also possible. The course are very supportive.
Oh, that's really good to know. And actually, this is ideal timing with this podcast going out in January as well, because people might be like, oh, there's another little string to my bow. And if people are waiting for clinical, but they are in a position where they could self-fund, or whether their current employer might consider self-funding them, it kind of prompts a little conversation, doesn't it? To kind of, yeah, to have not even a backup plan, but have a different plan, something that I certainly wasn't aware of. But this could have potentially been quite a good route for me, given my forensic background. And I might have quite liked doing qualifying in both, but it future-proofs you as well, doesn't it? So when I was qualifying, I was like, well, I could apply for forensic, and I ended up going down into clinical places, but you don't always necessarily want to work in forensic services, and you don't always necessarily want to work in clinical services, but when I became a mummy, for me, I felt like I wasn't so keen on going back to forensic. And I know some people feel the same as well. And when I was working with trainee forensic psychologists, some of them were saying at the time, I find it really difficult to work with people who've hurt animals, for example. And others would be saying, well, I find it really difficult to work with people who've hurt children. There's different like hard limits, isn't there? But just being qualified across both areas is really nice future proofing, because you don't know how your life might change, or how society and culture might change as well.
Yeah, and I agree completely, because I guess that's why I was really attracted to the course, because I thought, when I qualify, if I want to work in a particular clinical setting and a few years later I might want something different, then I have that flexibility to change. And I've always said, like, I really enjoy working in forensic settings now, but I'm not sure I would always want to work in a forensic setting. And there are other areas within forensics and other areas within clinical psychology that I find really interesting, like clinical kind of health services. So having that kind of option there, I think is something really important for me. And I think that's why people might be attracted to the course as well.
Definitely. Flexibility and choice. Like, yeah, all the way. Something that's been really interesting to talk about with some of the podcast guests recently is thinking about, how faith and culture shows up for them and how that fits with what they're doing in the psychology world. Would it be
Mhm.
okay, if you feel comfortable to talk about it, to talk a little bit about your faith and your culture and how that impacts on you and your psychology journey?
Yeah, sure. So I am from kind of an Asian Indian background, and I follow a religious faith as well. And I think kind of being in a field, as a brown Asian woman, there's not always a lot of people who look like me. There might be a lot of service users that are from kind of minority backgrounds, but actually there's not a lot of professionals that look like me and work with the same people that we do. So I think having representation in the field is really, really important. And it was only recently in somewhere I worked that I actually was able to work with people from a similar background of me, and I just found it really, really nice to have that view there. And I guess something that the course are really kind of seeing as important as well is with race and culture. And actually, in my course, we have race workshops. So we have them, I think, 3 or 4 times a year, and we get together with our cohort and some members of the course team, and we talk about things like race and culture and what we bring to our training, how we can help others to explore their race and culture and the impact that it has on them and their lives. So I think that's something that's really important to think about. And yeah, and just know, because I think that's maybe not something that a lot of people know about the course, that they are really driven about that. And I guess the course is based in Birmingham, and Birmingham is a really diverse area. So thinking about working with the communities we serve and having that representation and developing kind of professionals and trainees who are minded in that sense and have an appreciation for the impact it can have on people and their background is really important.
Yeah, I worked in the heart of Birmingham for 4 years after I qualified, and it's a real privilege to work with so many different cultures and backgrounds, but it's also a real skill. So in my working week, I would often be working probably with maybe even as many as 1 in 4 cases were using an interpreter,
Hmm.
either because the child or the young person didn't speak English or their parents didn't, and we needed to be able to kind of make sure everyone was understanding what we were doing. And it's a real skill, actually, learning to work with different cultures and to trying to respect different cultures and values. And I used to try and make it my mission that I would learn at least how to say hello and goodbye, and how are you,
Yeah.
to people in their own language. And I'd like have it all written down in my diary on the right page, and I'd have to flick to it and then like remind myself. But it seemed to fall out of my head as soon as I stopped working with that client. But yeah, it's important to do our best to work with people, to involve them with the service. But I think it is also a very unique skill that you build when you're working in really diverse areas.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really important, because I guess developing services that are culturally competent is really helping to serve the people that we work with. And if we think about, in a lot of cases that we know, that help seeking behaviors are less likely to be displayed by people of minority backgrounds or people who have immigrated here or not necessarily born in this country. So I think working with that is really important, and thinking about what we can do to help the people out there actually access the services and get the help that they need, and thinking about what we can do as professionals to make them feel a bit more comfortable, and if there's anything that we can put in place to make that more likely to happen. I think that's something that we should really be thinking about all the time.
I definitely agree. I definitely agree. And another question that I often ask people on the podcast is what your top tips, or the way that you help yourself to not burn out on your way to becoming qualified. So could you give us a little bit of a flavour about how you kind of sort your work-life balance out so that you're thriving, not just surviving?
Yeah, of course. And I think a lot of that is really important. I think one thing that's really important with that is firstly boundaries. And I was listening to another episode of your podcast earlier, and that was mentioned, and I thought, yeah, boundaries is really important. So for me, what I like to do is I try my best, and I'm not always good at this, and I think that's a very big learning curve for me, is to kind of work within your work hours and not go over your working hours, and make sure you're actually taking care of yourself in that way. And I guess the way that the course is structured is that we have 3 days of placement one university teaching day, which is face to face, and also one study day. And I try my best to stay within those boundaries. So I'm only going to do my placement work on placement days. I'm going to do my other uni assignments or my thesis stuff on my study day. And then I'm going to focus just on university teaching and socializing with people in the class on kind of my university days. And I guess one thing that I try to stick by the best as I can is not doing any work on the weekends. That's kind of uni related or work related. I say that I try my best, and especially like around now when it's like the more festive time where I want to be taking time off kind of placement and spending more time with friends and family. I think that's my saving grace. And the only time I try and do work on the weekends, for example, I've got an assignment coming up or something really important that I need to get finished by a particular deadline. But I find even if that means spending more time, Monday to Friday doing a particular piece of work, at least I have my weekends where I can rest and recover, spend time with my loved ones, go out and do things that are important to me. I like exercising, I have some fish that I take care of, my pets. So like lots of things like that. And that kind of helps to take a break, because people always say you have to get on training. But actually, when you get onto training, I kind of had the impression like I knew training would be difficult. And I think there are times where I found it a bit more difficult, or I've had more of a steeper learning curve. And other times where I felt, okay, it's not, I guess what I've learned is it's not intense 100% of the time. There are bits of the course where actually I might need to knuckle down and do a bit more work, and I have, less of a social life on the weekend. And there are other times where I'm feeling a bit more relaxed and I'm on top of things. So I guess boundaries, and I think time management was a real one, because there were times where I'm like, oh, I've got work coming up, but I'm going to have a break, and then I'm going to have an extended break, and then I'm not going to do any work, which is bad. So I think for me, learning how to manage that, to not be someone who's working 24/7, but taking some time out to relax, is how things like you can stop things like burnout, and just being honest with yourself and realizing when you do need a break. And I think also being honest to the course team. So we have kind of monthly meetings with someone from the course team, and it's kind of a check-in on how things are going with the course, how are things going academically, but also how are things going with placement. And then the last kind of most important question is, how are you? And actually that's your space to be really honest with yourself and with the course, and let them know if there's anything that you're finding difficult or struggling with. And they are really accommodating, and they are very supportive. So they're always kind of looking out for your best interest. And I think that's one of the really big perks of the course, is having that support from the course team.
Good. Yeah, it does make all the difference when you're seen as a human. But yeah, people find it strange when I say I really enjoyed my training. And my cohort have reminded me that I didn't always enjoy it. There was one particular experience which was quite challenging personally and professionally. And it led to me being quite upset, for probably a couple of weeks. And they're like, well, don't forget that, because that was still part of your experience. But on the whole, genuinely and generally, I really enjoyed it. Like, I felt like excited, I felt proud, I felt like I was able to achieve, and like I was doing good work and learning good stuff and having good relationships with my cohort and the people in my team. So yeah, I did enjoy it, and I felt like you said, it was tricky at times, and certainly it's not much fun when someone says, oh, do you want to come to the pub? And you go, no, because I've got an assignment to do. It doesn't, work doesn't always finish and end at like 5 p.m. because your clinical placement might do. We forensic placement in your case, but then you've got an assignment that that's due in next week, and so it is another added layer of demand. But it's well worth it. I wouldn't be speaking to you now had I not done what I'd done and got to the end. So but you should it should be enjoyable, at least at parts along your journey, I think.
Yeah, and I agree. And I go through those similar waves of kind of the imposter syndrome when you first start. And I think the imposter syndrome comes out every time I start a new placement. Like, what am I doing? Do I know my stuff? And actually, then I kind of relax and take back. And I think about all the teaching that I've had at university and all the things I've learned on placement, all of the things that I'm bringing from me, myself as a person, from my background, my culture, my experiences, my pre-qualification experiences, which have been the most important and valuable, in thinking about what I bring and what I learn, and putting those all together and actually realizing, oh, no, I'm okay. I know what I'm doing. There might be some times where I don't know, but there are people around me who can support me, whether that's people on the course, like my cohort who I really, 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 really get along with, or it could be people on the course team, or it could be kind of friends and family, and just knowing actually I'm okay. And yes, it's a process, it's 4 years, it might be a long time, longer than kind of clinical training, but actually it's really worth it in the end, and it's really rewarding to kind of be in a job where you can help people. And I think that's kind of another key motivator for me.
Definitely. It's the biggest privilege. People, I think you are a helpy type of person or you're not. But honestly, I think I've got the best job in the world. You might have the second best job in the world once you're qualified in dual modalities, but I just love it. I love what I do. And I consider it a real privilege. Anagha, have I not asked you something that you think I should have done?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
Good. We've covered most things, but honestly, it's been the biggest privilege to have you on here and to learn more about this pretty unique scheme to become dual qualified. So thank you so much for accepting my invitation to talk about it. And you've done an incredible job. And I know people will find it really interesting.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope someone out there listening to this might have an insight into a course that they might have not heard of. And I hope it helps someone.
And if people get on to training as a result of hearing about it, we want to know about it, don't we? We want, contact me, let me know, and I can get in contact with you and let you know, because, I love it when people say, oh, I didn't realize that I could do something else instead of an assistant post. And actually, because of reading your book or hearing your podcast, I've got this job that I wouldn't have even thought to search for. So it's really nice when we get to actually impact in a really positive way on people's lives from what we're doing. So yeah, if this is useful for you along the line, then yeah, we love your feedback. We love to know. So thank you so much, and wishing you all of the best with the rest of your training and with your doctoral thesis as well.
Thank you so much.
Wow, how amazing was that? Anagha has blown my mind, actually. It's really good to know that there's this dual modality way of qualifying, and it might be that there's other courses that are also offering this across the country as well, or it might just be that it's still Birmingham that are the only people doing it. But how incredible to think that exists. So thank you so much to Anagha. And like we said, if you find this interesting, or if it leads you down a different path than the one that you'd imagined, let us know. Let me know how that pans out for you. Do come along and share your thoughts about this episode and any other episode in the Aspiring Psychologist community on Facebook. Come along. It will say brackets free group. And if you'd like some more bespoke support, advice, guidance, please do consider joining the Aspiring Psychologist membership. And recently, someone in the membership had said that they'd joined because they weren't feeling that supported or understood by their supervisor at the time. And actually, it really helped them to feel like they were able to gain more relevant skills and experience. And that has been something that had been invaluable for them. So maybe you are in a particular job situation where you're not feeling perhaps able to learn CBT or different specialist approaches such as cognitive analytic therapy, or perhaps you're just not feeling able to do much reflective practice where you are working or with the staff team around you. And that's something that we really excel at in the membership as well. So if you think that might be useful, please do come along and consider joining us, because it's a really nice, supportive community. So thank you so much for listening. Please do take a moment to drop a review or even just a rating on Apple Podcasts, because it helps us to prove that what we're doing is useful and so helps us reach a wider audience. Thank you so much for your time and, as ever, for being part of my world. Take care.
Reflective accounts of mental health professionals on the way to getting qualified. So many tips and lessons to learn from, so many things that you can try. The Aspiring Psychologist Collective. The Aspiring Psychologist Collective. If you're looking to become a psychologist, then let this be your guide. With this podcast at your side, you'll be on your way to being qualified. It's the Aspiring Psychologist Podcast with Dr. Marianne Trent.